Welcome back. I have here with me again, Daniel Raim, the director of Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen. So Daniel, what an amazing film.
Thank you, Dave.
I have to be honest with you. When I first heard about your film, I wondered why, because we had recently programmed also a really nice film called Fiddler, Miracle of Miracles.
Correct.
But once I saw your film, I realized that that didn't matter at all. Your film is wonderful and approaches this film, it approaches this subject from a completely different angle.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My first question is about the genesis of the project.
Yeah.
So can you tell us how did this come to you to do this?
Yeah. I had already interviewed Norman Jewison and his production designer of Fiddler on the Roof, Robert Boyle, in 2000 for another documentary called The Man on Lincoln's Nose. That was nominated for the Best Documentary Short Subject. It was my first documentary about Robert Boyle, who was my professor at the American Film Institute. At the time, he was 90 years old and had designed, as an art director, production designer, over 100 movies, including 5 Hitchcock masterworks, like from Saboteur, Shadow of a Doubt, North by Northwest, The Birds, Marnie. And that caught Norman Jewison's eye when he was on the Universal lot, just starting to make movies. And Robert Boyle and Norman collaborated on The Russians Are Coming, Norman Jewison's The Russians Are Coming, and the Thomas Crown Affair, then Gaily Gaily, and then Fiddler on the Roof. So I'd already been interested in Fiddler on the Roof on a personal level, going all the way back, when I was, 10, 11, when my grandparents, who were survivors of the Holocaust, and their parents sadly didn't survive the Holocaust. And I'd always been aware of my background, through photographs. But to see a musical movie at the age of 10 that somehow, boy, these people look just like my great-grandparents, and it sort of gave, it was like a window into their world. And I was so moved by the music and the connection. And then I became a filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker, interested in telling stories about the creative process, the artists behind the scenes, the unsung heroes. And Robert Boyle was truly not only was he a great art director / filmmaker, he was just a great human being and a humanist. And I love the way he talked about what it means to be a filmmaker, a storyteller, and had interviewed Norman and Bob. So already Fiddler was on my mind, because the documentary, a quarter of it literally focuses on this epic location scout that I got to circle back and really expand on in this film. So I would say, look, just a lot of the films that I make kind of come out of relationships where people I've met, or teachers or mentors, or people who I want to kind of investigate. And so I think that was the genesis. So in 2009, 9 years after making the Man on Lincoln's Nose, when I saw Topol's farewell tour, Chaim Topol, who stars as Tevye, as you guys know, when I saw his farewell tour in Los Angeles, and I saw that I was just surrounded by people from varying ethnic backgrounds, right? And I thought, man, this really speaks to the soul of so many people. What is the origin of all this? So then I started to learn about Shalom Aleichem. And this is all long before there was a documentary about Shalom Aleichem, this fantastic film. I think it's called Laughing in the Dark. And I was fortunate enough to make a connection with Topol and interview him at his home in Tel Aviv in 2009. So that was really the starting point of this film.
Oh, wow. So I was going to ask you which interviews you conducted, and it sounds like did you conduct all of them?
I did. I conducted about 95% of the interviews.
Wow.
including Norman. So we see kind of Norman Jewison, we see him in the 1970s on set, and we're really fortunate to work with the National Film Board of Canada to license footage from them that enabled us to tell this story. But the interviews I did with Norman date back to 2000, and the spine of the film is an interview I did with Norman Jewison in 2016 at his home, where he really just kind of deep dived with me into the making of Fiddler on the Roof. And then 4 years later, I hadn't even watched the interview. I was busy with other projects, but I knew I needed this in the can, right? And Jay, I remember talking with you in 2017. I was sort of tempted to sort of go back into the Fiddler world, but little did I know another movie was being made. And I'm glad it was made, because it liberated me to really focus and make what I hope to have become like a character-driven portrait of Norman Jewison and the filmmakers working on Fiddler. So there's one other interview with Norman that the Directors Guild of America captured in 2014, where he talks about his bus ride through New Orleans. And that helped us kind of peel the onion a little bit and get to understand sort of the origins of Norman's sort of journey as an artist and human and socially aware, socially conscious filmmaker.
Yeah, well, that explains a lot, because we see Norman at so many different ages, and I thought,
That's great.
did you find these interviews, but you were just involved at all these different stages?
I did, yeah. So exactly. So I had this interview from 2000, and then the 2016 interview, and then I did just about every other interview in the film over the years, including Sheldon. So like a year later, I went to New York, met with Sheldon Harnick, and we sat down, and I think we, over 2 to 3 hours, did a career-spanning interview. So it was like and same with Topol. It wasn't just specific to the film. So I had all these like long, in-depth interviews. And then when lockdown started in 2000, I collaborated with Michael Sragow, who's the co-writer on this, and with Sasha Berman, who's the producer. Mike was also a lead researcher and co-producer. And we, at the time, Jay, at the early stages, I was still holding on to this idea of these great storytellers, right? So the Shalom Aleichem, his storytelling and his background, and then Topol as a storyteller, right, through acting, and then Norman Jewison. But as I was developing and making the film with Mike and Sasha, basically, I started to sort of whittle away all these extraneous subjects, themes, and really started to like ask the question, well, can we tell the story of Norman Jewison's journey, like his creative, spiritual journey? And he says, now that you've watched the film, he says towards the end of the film, I found myself making Fiddler on the Roof. Well, what does that mean? And what does that look like? And what did he find? And what were the questions? And how does that relate to our own sense of identity, Jewish or not, and who we are, our own exploration, finding ourselves. So that was part of the journey of making this.
Wow. Well, I have to say you're a very good interviewer. And I'm wondering, how do you prep for your interviews? Tell us.
That's a great question. I was really fortunate. Like, I think the big turning point for me in 2016, when I went to interview Norman Jewison, he had just published his autobiography. So that was like, that opened up so many doors for me in terms of my own curiosity. So he did talk about in his autobiography about when he was 6 years old, having his last name Jewison. He thought he was Jewish and was bullied, and he went with his best friend to synagogue, to the shul or to the Hebrew lessons, and talked about the kind of inner crisis he had in the late 60s when his close friend Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And he was already en route to London making Fiddler, but all these events are so kind of woven in, or what he calls churning together, right? That how do these life events and experiences and how do our preoccupations, how do artists' life, experiences inform the work? So my preparation, Jay, is to, I think I would say that I could spend 2-3 weeks preparing for an interview, as I do, reading a ton of material and making and writing down all the questions. But in the end of the day, I have to take all that, fold it up, put it in my back pocket, and have a discussion on camera and make a human connection and just let my genuine curiosity. But what we're doing in the interview process is we're making the film, is we're telling the story, we're discovering something that we didn't know. We're asking the person in front of us on camera to discover something that hopefully he or she had never talked about, like that kind of like thing where everyone has sort of their script, and they've, especially, if you've worked on a project, you sort of talk about it in that way, but hopefully we can discover something new.
Well, I discovered a lot about Norman Jewison that I did not know. And I found him to be such a playful and having such a gentle spirit. I loved what he said about timing being everything. The anecdote about Bobby Kennedy and his imitation of Bobby's voice and accent was just gold, pure gold.
That's right.
Wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Norman, maybe something that didn't make it into the film.
Just that his whole journey, coming of age as a filmmaker, born and raised in Canada and Ontario, as he talked about and his musical training really started when he was, maybe 10 years old. His aunt, who was very close with, provided him piano lessons, and she would have him read poetry and recite poetry. So he was already kind of like thinking about performing arts and music and really getting that, so when he graduated from college, he almost immediately found himself directing live television musical theater, which we touch upon. But even when he's like, 10 years later, when he's making In the Heat of the Night, and he's talking with Haskell Wexler about how to set up a shot, he's already thinking about the timing of the music that in the score by Quincy Jones, as Haskell's camera zooms into a bridge with something running across it. So he's all that background in musical, in music and in live television, and working with Harry Belafonte, and had really already kind of informed him, so that when he made his first movie musical, which apparently wasn't a fan of movie musicals, Hollywood musicals, but this was something kind of like Fiddler, which was truly in his soul, I think, to make. And what else can I add about Norman? I mean, he went on to do after In the Heat of the Night, he did A Soldier Story and Hurricane, which rounds out his trilogy of stories about African-American life and injustice. He wanted to make a film about Nat Turner and was kind of told, no, we want a Black director to do that. He also wanted to do a film about Malcolm X. So that brings it also into the kind of an interesting discussion of the fact that he wasn't Jewish and he's doing Fiddler on the Roof. And not to go too far off your question, but I think that raises also an interesting question. Like, one of those beloved films of all time that deals with Jewish history is made by a group of non-Jewish filmmakers, right? Including Robert Boyle, who's Irish American, and John Williams, and Ozzie Morris, who's the cinematographer from the UK, and Norman. And I'm just sort of delighted to have sort of learned through their own words about how they worked on Fiddler.
Yeah. Well, even one of the daughters is not Jewish, if I remember.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Michelle Marsh. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. That brings up a lot of current issues, I think,
It
too.
does. It certainly does.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad to think that because of certain current issues, a film like this may not have been made. Because I think he does such an amazing job. Yeah, I mean, I thought in your film there were many beautiful moments. I thought the synagogue scene was very beautiful. I
Hmm.
loved hearing Topol talking about truth. Sheldon Harnick singing. And he actually, I thought he had a beautiful voice
Oh,
at
so
that
good.
age. I was just amazed.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what are some of your favorite scenes in your own film?
Oh, my favorite. You know, the Isaac Stern story. You know, Norman and John Williams, like that. It's like we have to get Isaac Stern. You know,
Yeah.
and I wish, you know, maybe in the Blu-ray extras I can let Norman, who's, you mentioned her, is such a great raconteur, right, storyteller, and he can do when he tells a story he could play all the parts, right? So he really took, gosh, there's 15, 20, maybe more minutes to tell me that whole story of flying to Chicago and seeing Isaac Stern perform, and then he knocked on his apartment door, and this is not in the movie, right? And I wish we, you know, could have animated this because it's so wild. And Isaac Stern opens the door and he's all sweaty because he's rehearsing with his group in the living room, and he's like, Norman, go fix us some drinks, you know, and Norman just talks us through how he persuaded Isaac Stern, who was super busy, to play the Fiddler on the Roof, and to be, not to play the fiddler on the, but to do the score. And how one of my favorite scenes, you know, is just that Norman was in London and he bought a Chagall. I think it was a lithograph of the Fiddler on the Roof, signed by Chagall, and which he brought to the recording studio in London and put it, as Norman tells the story, you know, he shows it to Chagall, and Chagall says, we have the Fiddler here, we have Chagall here, and says Chagall's uncle would climb on the roof and get drunk and play the fiddle, and in honor of Chagall's uncle, I'm going to play a quarter tone flat. And I asked John Williams, did he really play it a quarter tone flat? And John Williams says it's a great joke, but of course not. But yeah, you know, you mentioned the shul, the painted synagogue. Oh, so great to thanks to Elisa Solomon, who wrote this wonderful book called A Wonder of Wonders, a cultural history of Fiddler on the Roof. We were able to include in the narration a beautiful excerpt from her book describing all of the details in the painted synagogue of what we're looking at. And to have, it was very kind of Jeff Goldblum to contribute to our documentary through the narration, and to bring that to life, because when the film was finished, Norman worked out to have that painted synagogues. There was nothing left, you know, after the Holocaust, all the painted synagogues, wooden painted synagogues burned down. And there was a plan to dismantle it and transfer it to Bar Ilan University in Israel. And it was dismantled and packaged, but at the last minute, Bar Ilan just pulled the plug on it. So it doesn't exist anymore. So it's great to sort of linger and slow it down like to 10% speed. Because if you watch the movie, the camera pans across the wall, but here in the documentary, really get to really slow it down and savor the details.
Mm-hmm. You might want to check out this film we showed years ago. It's called Raising the Roof, and it was about creating this dome of one of those painted synagogues, which is in I think it's in a museum in Warsaw.
Okay, I've heard about it. Thank you.
So another question I had was, what were some of your biggest challenges in bringing your documentary to the screen?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge was deciding to investigate and explore, I don't think investigate's the right word, but explore Norman's, to really tell the story through his experience. And if we can find, what I mentioned to you, additional material, like the Directors Guild of America had done also like a very long sit down interview with him where he talked about the bus ride that he did when he was 17 years old to New Orleans and experienced segregation for the first time and got off the bus. So it's really kind of, can we find the arc on one hand? And what were the other challenges? I think that my heart, going into this project and having interviewed Dan Baron, who's one of the great Shalom Aleichem scholars, and Topol at length about his life, and it's painful to sort of like to have the discipline to distill, refine, and cut out certain story elements that were so dear to me. Like I couldn't wait to kind of dive into aspects of Shalom Aleichem's journey that weren't even in this wonderful documentary, Laughing in the Dark, about how he met a real life milkman named Tevye who would bring milk to his family in the Ukraine. And his daughter wrote about in her memoir, her memoir about meeting the real life Tevye. So all these elements, all these like delicious, lovely things. That was a challenge for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think that's universal for filmmakers, killing your darlings.
Yes.
So speaking of pain, I think in the film, I think it's Kenneth Turin who says that Fiddler was musical comedy, but you still feel the pain.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little on that?
Absolutely. I mean, the second act, right, picks up after the first, in the movie, pogrom, right, where they were warned. I mean, imagine having, you're marrying off your daughter, and you experience a violent pogrom at your daughter's wedding. But beside that, I think that the intensity of Topol, who's so endearing, and Tevye, the milkman, who's so endearing and wrestling with these issues of tradition and modernity and his daughter's wishes, and he loves his daughters, but the movie's about the disillusion of a family. And and I think that in Norman's film, what makes it so timeless and beautiful is just how he he's an actor's director, so working with the actors, you feel the pain, and it's not overt. And I think it's just, there's just this ache that's so universal, whether or not, you're in the Chava story where she's basically shut out from the family because she's married a non-Jew. I think that's the pain that we can all relate to, because we've all been children or parents or both, and I think that's part of the kind of universal appeal of Fiddler on the Roof that speaks to all of us.
Absolutely, yeah. That scene with Chava towards the end is unbelievable.
Yeah, and then there's the pain of the whole village, basically emptying out, right? Just everyone with their belongings and going to America, some going to Palestine, Israel at that time, Palestine at that time, and these are issues that we're still grappling with today. And in the case of Kenny Turan, who spent a lot of time in Sarajevo, and he really felt, could speak to that Yugoslavia just doesn't exist anymore. Anatevka never existed. It's a fake shtetl, but Jewish life in Eastern Europe certainly doesn't exist the way it did. And it's, it's fast, Topol speaks to his own personal family pain. You know, he went to visit a shtetl in Eastern Europe and came back with these photographs to show his father, who had no interest in seeing or remembering Jewish life in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. The more I, seeing your film and seeing Fiddler again a couple of years ago, I really appreciate the casting of Topol, I have to say. Even though I think it was Kenneth Turan who thought it should be a Eastern European.
That's right,
absolutely. Not an Israeli Jew, but
yeah,
I think the maybe on stage seeing Zero Mostel and his shtick would have been fun, but I think in the film Topol brings a gravitas that I don't think Zero Mostel would have brought. Just my 2 cents.
Indeed, 100%. Yeah, which is in line with Norman's vision from the beginning. He really wanted to bring audiences into a kind of a realism, and he even wanted the dance numbers to sort of not happen out of nowhere. He wanted everything to sort of be like, this could be real life. Yeah.
Right. Well, Daniel, thank you so much. Is there anything do you want to say before we end?
Well, just thank you for screening the documentary. It's just great to share this film with the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival Winterfest audience, and I just want to make sure I just said that right in case you're editing, the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival Winterfest audience. And a shout out to my team, to Michael Strago and Sasha Berman for spending a year and a half on Zoom with me as we talked through the film, and to everyone who worked on the film, to Norm, just and especially, the 3 actresses. That for me was the revelation making this film. Like that, I think was the big discovery for me. And as you mentioned, I think you mentioned the casting of Chaim Topol. I think the casting of these 3 unknown actresses who weren't maybe as John Williams says, the best singers, but he wanted village girls. He didn't want 3 girls who could. I think their charm and their inner life, which I think and I hope my documentary camera captured a little bit of their humanness too. And I think through the journey of making this film, Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen, I think I learned about how much their performances and their humanity resonate and make Norman Jewison's version of Fiddler on the Roof such a timeless and wonderful film, including Robert Boyle and Ozzie Morris and everyone else. So that's
well, it's great hearing the backstory, because as much as it's a film about Norman Jewison and Fiddler, it's also, you gave us a sense of how it's a film about your career too, with all these interviews from many years, different films, and wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.
Take care. Bye, everyone.